Hey everyone, welcome back, and may have gotten a little ahead of myself with this one. So, to start, hey everyone, it's Afrodo Reviews here. Welcome back. And welcome back to the channel. Here we decide, is that worth reading over second breakfast? Or does it deserve the fiery pits of Mount Doom? It's time to decide. Now, when I say I got a little ahead of myself, as you know, I posted a poll on my channel to say, hey, what should I do this December? And I give a variety of options. And ultimately, the choice was gone to go with D&D December, which, I'll be honest, I was hoping for that one too. So I'm glad you guys chose it. Thank you very much. Gives me a chance to read a whole bunch of D&D books. But, so when I curated my list, I went with some obvious ones, and, you know, I figured, oh, let's continue the Drizz't saga, because I've reviewed them on this channel before. I've definitely done Homeland, and, definitely did the second book, right?
I was wrong. I was so wrong.
I may not have actually reviewed the second book on this channel, I may have just read it. So, I apologize, but if that's the case, maybe I'm wrong. But if that's the case, and I've only reviewed the first book on this channel, not the second book, I've already read this, and I've already written up the entire review before I realized what happened, so it's going to be a little out of order. Just think of it like the Dresden Files. Well, I did the fifth book first. To get on with it, published on May 1st of 1991, Sojourn is the third book in the Drizz't Saga, the finale to the Dark Elf Trilogy, written as a prequel to the Icewind Dale Trilogy. Drizzt, originally only a minor side character for Wolfguard the Barbarian in the Icewind Dale series, achieved a level of popularity that R.A. Salvatore hadn't expected, and thus fed into every DM's woes for years after the fact by creating the inspiration that would lead to dozens of chaotic neutral drow copycats. If you want to know more about the inner workings of the Dark Elf Trilogy, I suggest checking out at least my first video, maybe my Exile video if that exists somewhere, where I go a bit more into the various adaptations of the series and so on. However, since this is the third book on this channel, this is the third book. As you can tell, I wrote this script before I realized I hadn't done the other video. I'll leave it here and move on to the report card. Now let us discuss this cover. And of course, this is where we lead into the common thing about stories where they're not only about 30 years old at this point, but also are very well known. And that's that there are a fair amount of covers. At least I thought when I looked it up. But for the sake of it, the one I have is okay. Yeah, it features our hero, Drizzt emerging from the Underdark into the shining light of the surface. The covers works best when you really open it up and appreciate it as one completed artwork, as the back of the book shows more of the surface world, where a ranger, followed by a bear, seems to be slowly approaching where Drizzt is. And that ranger has a much more significant story, if it's the one I think he is. And the distant mountains clearly hint at where Drizzt is going to be later on in the book. So all in all, it's an okay cover. The original obviously still makes me laugh because, like many things, like many of these old early 90s, late 80s fantasy books, Drizzt has got the 80s mom hairdo in it, so I can't hate it. But yeah, overall, they're all decent covers. I don't really have much to comment on it critically when it comes to these. So we'll move on to the synopsis. Now before I do this, I should remind people that this is book 3 of a trilogy, so there will be some context that I simply cannot cover in this video alone. I highly recommend either being familiar with this book or watching my previous videos on this before continuing with this one. I put one video earlier, and if the other one exists, it's up there above me. So I'll give you guys a second to decide. And we'll move on to the synopsis. Now, the synopsis of this book actually isn't on this book. The only thing on this book is, it burned my eyes and pained every part of my body. It destroyed my puafi, I think that's how you pronounce it, and boots, stole the magic from my armor, and weakened my trust in scimitars. Still, every day without fail, I was there, sitting upon my perch, my judgment seat, to await the arrival of sunrise. Which is basically just the first line of the novel. So, to give a more accurate synopsis, this book follows Drizzt after the consequences of the previous two books and his final ascent into the surface world, where we'll meet him in the next trilogy. This book is mostly just Drizzt trying to acclimate to the surface world, starting with his attempt of thinking to integrate with a series of farmers, to meeting a blind ranger who teaches him stuff, and then eventually moving on to the Icewind Dales, where he'll be for Wolfgar the Barbarian to find later on. Overall, I can't delve too much into it without giving too many spoilers, and even though this book is about 33 years old at this point, I'm still gonna try to maintain my distinction between the spoiler-free and the spoiler-filled reviews. So, let's go ahead and move on to those reviews in specific. Obviously, the first is the spoiler-free, as best as I can get it. And the real question in that lies, does the book hold up? I liked it the least of the Dark Elf trilogy, which is strange because I was definitely hoping that Drizzt's eventual escape to the surface world was going to mark the best parts of the Drow Rangers prequel series, showing him integrating with surface society, learning his way around, even though I knew he probably wasn't going to be accepted by the wider world and end up on his lonesome. It would have at least been a lot more interesting to see than the previous two works where he's suffering from the evils of the Underdark, effectively. As I mentioned in my previous reviews, I haven't actually read the original Icewind Dale trilogy. Not yet, anyways. And that's because I have a strong inclination to always go chronologically when I can. This book doesn't really do me any favors because there's an epilogue that does kind of spoil that, so yippee about that. But in the end, that's what I chose to do. So, my review here is going to be based only on having read the Dark Elf trilogy and not the Icewind Dale trilogy. So I say that because I don't really know where the story was going when we started on this journey. But I will say one of the things that became very clear in this book is that near about the middle of this story, it's super obvious that R.A. Salvatore needed to get Drizzt to a specific location to end his story on. It became somewhat obvious that that's what he was doing around that time, even as someone who hasn't read the following books that Drizzt actually debuted in just yet. So there were times it definitely felt a tad forced when Drizzt was forced to go to one area or decides to travel there for no real reason other than, well, I gotta go that way. Even when he seems to find some manner of acceptance within the groups he's been staying with, the very thing he's been craving since the start of the book, he just kind of leaves because, at this point, in his own words, he is no longer the self-pitying drow and will leave to find a better place. You know what I mean? I would say that the biggest issue of this book that I can talk about in this non-spoiler section of the review is that the book had an unfortunate problem of dragging along. It's the shortest of the prequel novels, and yet somehow it feels the longest to read. There are times when this book was nice and comfortable, and though it was slow-paced at those times, it didn't really feel like a chore to read. But there are other times, especially more toward the middle with Mushi, after a certain bit, that the book just kind of seemed to plod along. Which is ironic, because at that point in the book, Drizzt should be undergoing his biggest character changes, where he goes from the drow that he was in the previous books and becomes the drow he is when he's first debuted. And another thing, I'm not too enthused with the introduction of Katie Bree in this book, namely because the story introduces her as an 11-year-old child who befriends Drizzt and is one of the first people to see past his species. Which is nice and great, except if my knowledge of Drizzt's mythos is correct, doesn't Katie Bree become his wife later? I don't know. It just feels kind of weird to see our protagonist as a grown adult telling tales to a child around a campfire with the knowledge that he's going to marry and have kids with that child in a few years. It doesn't sit right with me, even considering the fantastical differences in age. I did read a couple things. Okay. I will also admit that... Okay. So I mentioned in at least my first review, or that R.A. Salvatore had recently apologized for reinforcing racist fantasy tropes with his Drizzt novels. And at the time, I did disagree with that because while the Drow aren't born evil, and that book makes it very clear that Drow aren't born evil, it's their society that turns them evil. As such, I never really did feel like R.A. Salvatore was saying that the Drow were inherently evil, which would be the racist thing. Merely that a combination of their overbearing gods and the evil leaders were enforcing terrible cultural conditions, which led to most of them becoming evil or dying when they try to cling to their goodness. And while this does give Drizzt a little too much of a not like other Drow, where he somehow, for no explained reason whatsoever, just maintained his great goodness, it was still at least understandable from a perspective. He's not born good, he just stayed good. That being said, I did read a couple things in this book that have changed my mind. There was something online I read, but I can't seem to find it here, so I'm not going to spread it around. I can't reconfirm that that's actually what happened. But I will say that this book, however, does start with the sort of fall into the, wow, that was kind of racist moments way more often than the previous two books. The first is that Drizzt is repeatedly called the Black Devil, which is definitely unintentional on R.A. Salvatore's part, but can't help make me realize how wrongly that can be taken. It's kind of one of those, you think about it for a second and you're like, ooh, maybe we think that one.
I'm sure Africa is a beautiful place, but the worst creatures come out of there. I'm just saying.
But for a moment, for a in-depth example, when Drizzt is being taught by his new friend Mushi, the open-minded ranger, they have some trouble with orc raiders in the series. Mushi talks about Mushi, this supposed to be paragon of goodness that's teaching Drow to be a ranger, talks about orcs as if they aren't even sapient and openly brags about how much he enjoys killing them. Now, this wasn't too bad if it was meant to show a prejudice that was gained over the years of dealing with the worst of orc kind, but then we have a scene that really cemented this. You really cemented this as a narrative topic rather than a character's prejudices, I should say. You see, during a battle, Drizzt has a beat on an orc leader with a crossbow. He has absolutely no qualms about killing this leader and is about to pull the trigger, having killed several other orcs at this point without hesitating. And all of this is fairly justified. The orcs attack them first in every scenario, and he was always defending himself. However, in this instance, Drizzt sees the human antagonist, Roddy McGristle. I'll talk about him in depth later. Check out the spoiler section because... But anyways, he sees Roddy McGristle standing next to the orc boss and realizes he's responsible for leading this orc attack. So Drizzt turns his crossbow to Roddy for a second and contemplates shooting him. However, he can't go through with it. Well, why not? Oh, it's just because Roddy's a human, not filthy orc scum. So obviously Drizzt can't just kill him without a second thought. I mean, it's not like Drizzt realizes in this moment that Roddy's responsible for the current predicament and is currently working with knowingly evil people and has sicked them on someone he once called a friend, all out of a misplaced sense of vengeance. No, let's just keep slaughtering orcs without a twinge of regret, but let's leave Roddy all alone. He's perfectly fine. This occurs on more than one occasion. But this brings me more to my spoiler-filled part of the review. Because I can't simply bring up Roddy McGristle and not give in to my rage-filled need to rant on this character. So here's your warning. From now on, the review is going to be spoiler-filled, and now's your chance to escape. Yeah, so I absolutely hated Roddy McGristle as an antagonist. And not just necessarily in the way that Salvatore wanted me to. You see, I did hate him in that way, and more on that in a second. But when you compare Roddy McGristle to the antagonist of the previous book, he just, one, doesn't hold a torch to them in terms of actual theater, I guess is a good way of putting it. Whether it be Matron Malice, Drizzt's own mother, determined to kill him to earn favor back with her chaotic evil goddess by using the corpse, the possessed corpse of his father to hunt him down, or the first book where the antagonist was less of a single person and more the evil of Drow society, or at least Minzo Berenzan itself, Roddy McGristle just doesn't work for me. In theory, he should. A vain bounty hunter who's consumed by vengeance, fueled by his own prejudice against Dark Elves. McGristle wants to kill Drizzt Do'Urden because Drizzt scarred him in a brief fight they had. He wants to kill Drizzt less out of a sense of duty or morality, but purely out of a sense of easing his own wounded pride. So much so that Roddy becomes the very kind of person he keeps accusing Drizzt of being. On paper, this should work great in a story, where Drizzt finally comes to the surface and turns into the hero we'll meet into the next trilogy, while the person who was the hero slowly becomes the villain he thinks Drizzt is.
Sometimes an enemy doesn't exist till you're looking for one.
And yet, Roddy doesn't work. And I think a part of that is because he doesn't really suffer any consequences at the end of the day. Yeah, this guy who murders and tortures several good people, and at one point implies he's going to harm a child in a certain kind of way if she doesn't lead him to Drizzt, gets absolutely no comeuppance by the end of the book. This is a character, in this reader's humble opinion, that needed to die. Thematically, it would work best if he was killed by a mob of people who ignored Drizzt for the sake of going after him, but instead he's allowed to just limp away at the end of the book. The only one who suffers any real consequences for his actions are his hunting dogs. One dies and one loses a leg at the very end of the book. And this is especially egregious because Roddy kills more than one named character in his pursuit of Drizzt. And it's never really in an emotionally climactic way either. The elf who was the first surface elf that Drizzt interacts with in a way that isn't hostile, and then secretly watches over Drizzt protecting him for about a year, what happens to him? Well, when this elf tries to arrest Roddy, Roddy is freed from his bonds and then strangles him to death in a couple of sentences. So fast that I actually missed it on my first read-through and had to go back and reread. Because I was like, wait, what? Whoa, he's dead? What about this Fey Quickling, who's one of Drizzt's worst enemies and is responsible for a fair amount of the trouble that Drizzt suffers through the entire first half of the book? Everything from nicking at him, stealing the blade that frames him for a murder, telling people where he is to try and get him killed, all of that stuff. What happens to him? How does this character die? Well, Roddy puts him in a sack and then beats him against the wall until he dies. What about the amusing, if odd, masochistic monk order who Drizzt travels with for a bit, and even offer him a place among them after he saves them from a dangerous scenario? Showing that even though the oddballs that they are, they have come to accept Drizzt for the person he is, in spite of their misgivings. Well, Roddy tortures them off screen and is implied to have killed them. Look, this isn't the kind of antagonist you set up to hang his head and limp home in shame at the end of the day. Disney villains who have done less have gotten worse comeuppance than this guy. This guy has a pretty good comparison to Clayton, of all people, in the Tarzan movies. And what happens to Clayton at the end of the movie? Look, when even a Disney film aimed at kids can punish your villain in a more satisfying way than this book aimed at adults, you done something wrong. A couple other minor points I'll bring up is that I wasn't really crazy about how Drizzt's training and magical items were treated. One of the things that was weird for me was that the enchantments of his sword literally fade away, and his thanks for correcting that. Autocorrect. His Puafi, or Pwif, or whatever. I honestly have no idea how to say it, so I apologize. Pwafi, or I'll just say cloak, literally shedded itself to tatters, and the enchantment on his armor fades away because he went out in the sun. Maybe this is something that exists earlier editions of D&D, or that drow magic only works in the Underdark. Or maybe this was just R.A. Salvatore realizing he has to get rid of all the Drizzt's magic items because he doesn't have them in the next book. But the idea that drow magic only works in the Underdark just bothered me a little, and really reduces their presence as a threat to the surface world. Another thing I want to note is that I wasn't exactly fond of the whole god debate in this book. This is another one of those things that I think only happened because the original trilogy, Drizzt was a follower of the particular goddess he ends up as a follower in this book. And Salvatore needed to explain why. But the idea that Drizzt had to follow a god feels ultimately strange. When he openly admits that his time underneath Lolth has left him distrusting of any deity and he has no desire to find a new one to follow, his friend Mushi just kind of waves him off like, nah, you're totally going to believe in my goddess. You just don't know it yet. Which felt to me incredibly dismissive of the trauma that Drizzt has suffered, and created this sense of he needs to worship a goddess to feel whole. Which, as someone who's not religious, had a very bad feeling to me. I don't believe religion is necessarily important to anyone's redemption of anything, to be honest with you. I also think that R.A. Salvatore really missed his chance when it comes to the Thistledown family. Honestly, reading this, when I read the sections with them in it, I really wanted Drizzt to approach this family, and the two to have interactions with each other beyond what they did have. There was a definite dynamic that would have been set with each of the family members. From the young children who saw Drizzt as some kind of mythical figure, to the oldest son who knows what a danger Drizzt would be if he was like any of the other dark elves he'd heard about, but at the same time would have a respect for Drizzt due to his martial prowess, to the Thistledown father, who knows he should assume the worst about Drizzt, but because of Drizzt's interactions with his kids, has made him doubt our main character's evilness. And the story seems to be building up to that at first, just for the first section's big bad to murder the entire family in the last part of a chapter. That's it. That's what it built up to.
My disappointment is immeasurable, and my day is ruined.
And yes, I get what R.A. Salvatore was going for. He was purposely making us feel that way so it feels all the more tragic when the murder happens, and robs Drizzt of the chance to potentially integrate peacefully into a society. It also gives Drizzt more to angst about throughout the entirety of the book. The problem is, when you do that kind of thing, you need to replace it with something that is even better. Maybe if the big bad was relevant past a certain point of the book, but no. He's killed off pretty quickly, and in the end didn't really matter to the overall story of the book. Maybe if the murder of the family caused Drizzt to be pursued and ultimately meet Dove Falconhand's party, in an actual sense where she comes in and she's the ranger who taught him how to be a ranger, and this gave him this group of people to call friends, but no, they just sort of give up their pursuit of Drizzt after a couple of members of their party get injured by stone giants, and the only one who keeps following him is that elf I mentioned earlier that Roddy kills. But they never actually meet, that elf just follows him from a distance and watches over him. The murder of the Thistledown family felt like it only happened because R.A. Salvatore needed Drizzt not to be at this farmhouse later on in the story, and perhaps because it was a shocking way to end that particular chapter. And this all comes down to the main complaint that for the entirety of the book, Drizzt just feels less like a character and more like a chess piece that's being shifted back and forth along the board to fit whatever R.A. Salvatore's already established world. He doesn't have a lot of character, and most of the characterization he does receive is stuff that is being worked out of him. This feels like he's just there to introduce more interesting characters and then move on when those characters have outlived R. Salvatore's interest in them. I brought up Dove Falconhand's party for a reason. Dove Falconhand was a very interesting character, and she had another character in the party, a dwarf named Fred, who's very persnickety, But the dynamic and their characters was just so much more interesting than anything Drizzt gave us that I wanted Drizzt to join their group just so they wouldn't leave. And I was eagerly awaiting for when Salvatore would bring them back, only to just deflate in disappointment when the story pays off Doug's inclusion with her sending a letter to Mushi saying, "Yeah, I knew the Dark Elf was good. Suck it." Also, Salvatore briefly forgot that this world doesn't operate on our world's calendar system. A fun fact for any newer D&D fans or the ones who haven't really delved that deep into lore just yet. But in the Forgotten Realms, there aren't weeks, there are 10 days, because each month is only 30 days, and there's an additional 5 days in between the months to make it a full 365 days. And because of that, the months aren't called what we call them, they're called something else. For example, so if Salvatore wanted to say that there was a January thaw, what he should have said instead, that sounds kind of weird to say. What he should have instead said was that it was an early hammer thaw, because the first month of the year in the Forgotten Realms setting is called Hammer. Anyways, I'll give the book a 6 out of 10. Yeah, this was a rather disappointing ending to an otherwise decent trilogy. When I read the first book of this prequel trilogy, I was excited and happy. This sequel had some more issues, but it was still going strong, and I was still excited to see where things would end up. The finale, though, I mean, it's not a terrible book, and unlike, say, The Last Murder at the End of the World, the most recent 6 out of 10 I did, it's very much just this was kind of boring, rather than the foundational crux of this book is disappointing, and thus ruins the otherwise stellar book around it. I can still recommend reading this one to anyone who wants to finish up the Dark Elf trilogy. It does still have some nice character, it does still have some nice moments, some nice revelations, and so on. It's not bad enough that I would be like, you definitely need to avoid this one, but it is definitely more along the lines of, yeah, just kind of suffer through it and then get done with it. You won't hate it, but if this book was disconnected from the rest of the trilogy, you'd forget it exists. Because of that, I can't rightly say it deserves Mount Doom, but it's still not very good. That being said, just remember. I don't know why I did that. I was going to commit to the just remember, but I didn't. Anyways, before we go, I've been told by my mom that she can't read my shirts very well, so I'm going to go ahead and do this. Hopefully you guys can see it pretty well, because I can't see the camera no more. With that, I'll be saying, see you later, everyone. Just remember, with every book comes an adventure, and every adventure is worth having, even the bad ones. Peace out. Now I can't say peace out. See you later, everyone.